if you did it in a linear way, you'd have half or even more than half of the film with this full action star sort of like going from film to film. And then you would have had the last half of the film and he's had this accident and he's in a wheelchair all the time. And it would have felt like a different film. So the way you get around that, in a sense, is by sort of like putting the two things together and seeing the emotional resonance of somebody who loses everything, all of his physicality, all of his natural human powers, let alone superpowers, and is then kind of forced to reconsider his whole life in light of what has happened.
Our life, if you want to describe Ian and Peter, the three lines we say is emotion over information. Information without emotion is irrelevant.
If you're a working or aspiring documentary filmmaker, and you know your stories aren't yet at the level of the films you admire, this show is for you. I'm Nigel Levy, creator of DocFix, a practical storytelling system developed from decades at the highest levels of documentary and factual filmmaking. I've worked with Oscar, Emmy and BAFTA winning teams across genres, including series editing Netflix's Formula One Drive to Survive, producing and directing Emmy-nominated feature documentaries, and writing for Sir David Attenborough. In DocFix, we break down how world-class documentaries are actually built, so you can turn your idea into festival and broadcast-ready films without film school. Today's episode is a special one. I'm talking with Peter Ettedgui and Ian Bonhôte, directors of Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story, which went on to win the BAFTA for Best Documentary. We recorded this just after the film was released, before awards season, so what you'll hear is pure process and philosophy and the intention they had for their film. We get into why they refuse to tell Reeve's life in a simple linear way, how they use the present after his accident as the lens on his past, their emotion over information approach, and how family, heroism, and visual motifs like the Superman statue all tie the film together. If you want more episodes like this, follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss them. That done, here's my conversation with Peter and Ian about Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story. Really lovely to see you both, and thanks so much for taking the time because I know you're incredibly busy. And it's lovely to talk about a film that's just come out, that is in the cinema, which is a beautiful thing, and there was so much to admire about it. And what I want to talk to you about is how you told it, some of the choices you made. You've done it in a very complex and rich and interesting way. And I did read a review that said they didn't make it chronological. That was one of the reviews that pointed out that you'd created a very interesting film. So if we can start by talking about that process, how did you decide how to tell this story? What choices did you make?
The thing is that when you're doing a biopic, whether it's fiction or non-fiction or dramatized or documentary, you have the same sorts of choices to make. Do you tell it in a linear way? If not, then what do you focus on? How do you make it interesting? And with us, I think that this was actually in many respects quite an obvious choice to make because, if you did it in a linear way, you'd have half or even more than half of the film with this full action star sort of like going from film to film and doing a little bit of his sort of civil rights work, human rights work, and so on. If you would have done it in a very linear way, then you would have had the last half of the film and he's in a wheelchair. He's had this accident and he's in a wheelchair all the time. And it would have felt like a different film. So the way you get around that, in a sense, is by sort of like putting the two things together and seeing the emotional resonance of somebody who loses everything, all of his physicality, all of his natural human powers, let alone superpowers, and is then kind of forced to reconsider his whole life in light of what has happened. There's an emotional quality in that. I had to think back to the time when I was whole, when I was healthy. And I think that just having that as the present tense of the film after the accident, looking back at his past, is just a very natural way to dig into the story of what the past was and how he uses the past to impact his own present and future, in a sense, at becoming an advocate for people with disabilities and so on. I think that's... Oh, the other thing I should say is that Christopher himself wrote a memoir in which he did sort of like interlace past and present. We then took that on much further, I think, and also we tried to find a cinematic equivalent to accomplish that.
I just add that one of the theme, which was heroism, which we settled very early on, it made a lot of sense to have the heroism of the character of Superman and the heroism of Chris's life post-accident, and how to, so as Peter said, it wasn't for us, it wasn't groundbreaking to try to do it like this. I think where I'm extremely proud is how successful it worked and how tough it was at times to find those segues and to make it work, because that was a lot of work and a lot of different ways we tried. And it's, in a way,
Very true.
the film we have is, I believe, the best we could have made. Do you see what I mean? It's not every single decision there's no happy accident, there's no easy accident. It was very, very crafted from all of us.
It's one thing having an idea, a conceptual idea in documentary, whereas in fiction, obviously you can write a screenplay. With this, you are so dependent on your archive and your interviews and what kind of comes out of that process. Finding those segues, which you would have written in a second if you were writing a screenplay, to come up with segues that really felt natural or counterpointed or mirrored in some way what was going on in each story, and keep the dramatic tension in each of the stories, the past and the present, going. That was where the hard graft was.
In the nicest possible way, it looks crafted. There are things going on with the themes and the arguments and where the drama is that doesn't happen by accident. And it was a pleasure. I watched it with a pen in hand. I've made more notes. It takes away some of the joy, but I only saw it a few hours ago. Here's something I picked up on that wasn't an accident, I am sure. Dana, and it's Dana, isn't it?
Yeah.
I have to get that right. Dana and Chris are very different people. And they seem to be, to me, there was this conflict between the two of them that came out in many, many beautiful ways. When you are creating a story like that, what's it like finding the moments in the material that matches what you think the film is actually about?
There is a little bit of searching and scratching. And I think then was not a surprise, like, oh, we were looking for a surprise, but I didn't know personally so much about this personal relationship. And then when you start digging into the relationship, you're completely right that there is definitely that clash between them two. But I think what we realized, how important she became to him, for him as a human being and for the family. And then how did she become so big and important for the foundation, about what she felt about caring for people, not only pushing to find a cure and pushing the science forward. And then seeing how she carried on after his passing. I think that love story, that love as a story, is a big thing within our film.
The fact that Christopher was so driven and sort of like, kind of his focus was laser-like. And Dana was somehow was softer and more expansive in her, which she could afford to be, because of course she was still very much on two legs. And I mean, that whole thing about tomorrow's cure that drove Chris, and then, well, what about today's care that drives Dana? Because Dana is the person that most of us would expect to be. We wouldn't necessarily expect to be quadriplegic on a ventilator, but we might be in a situation more easily, potentially, where we are having to care for someone. And so she's immediately identifiable to most people who haven't had an accident like that. But, as you were saying, I mean, she was just like, she is such a force of life in the story, and she brings to it a kind of a humanity that was really necessary.
I had a question from someone who wanted to ask you a question. They said the film felt very contemporary and important. And it's interesting that phrase was used. He said, someone called Brian, said that the importance of family was so important. He talked about the 1996 convention speech that Chris gave. He said it felt that family, the statement he was making about family was saying something about, in opposition to the divisive climate we're in today, this sense of a unifying family. Did you feel that when you chose to use that piece? Where did it fit for you in the story that you were
I mean,
telling about?
the whole film became about family for us from a very, very early point. I mean, obviously, when you come into a project like this, you're kind of like thinking about it in broad terms. You're thinking, oh, it's a story about the greatest on-screen hero who becomes the greatest off-screen, and you do all of that. But then we started meeting the family, and we realized that actually it was as much, if not more, about these three children as it was about Christopher or even Dana. At that point, it's a story about a family. And that's something that also, because both of us are very family minded, we always put our family on top of our work. And I think that it was just something that we felt, okay, well, we don't know what it's like. The audience doesn't know what it's like to be Superman, but we all know what it's like to be part of the family with all of the issues and wonderful things that kind of come out of that.
This is my point. The reason I asked it, or the question under my question, is the deeper and more authentically emotional you are, the more universal it becomes. And it feels present. It feels contemporary because you're talking about a universal truth.
Nigel, our life, if you want to describe Ian and Peter, the three lines we say is emotion over information. Information without emotion is irrelevant, and too much information without emotion just goes above your head. It's better to shorten the amount of information, and we feel there's a problem, not there's a problem with documentary. Some filmmaker in the documentary space thinks that people don't get enough information from somewhere else. So some stories are not, and that's why there's many times a journalistic element was really digging into, and a lot of people within the documentary culture love that. But sadly, as a producer as well, who runs a company, those stories, they might be great, but they don't get a broader audience because they've become too informational, and the audiences can't emotionally connect to that anymore because they can't take anymore. And again, as Peter said, you said earlier, a lot of people can't identify with being a successful actor at 23, 24, being in a $500 million successful movie. Really few people, even if you meet the Reeve children, it's hard to identify with people who are 2.5 meters high, 10 times smarter than you, 10 times more good looking than you. My wife is like, she kept on going on again the other day about Alexander, and she's like, how can she do all of that? And she looks like she's a brilliant mom as well. And you're like, you know, they are quite incredible people. Obviously, she's got an amazing partner, Garen, as well, that is very present with the family. So when she's absent, she is there, and vice versa. But they are quite phenomenal as human beings. They're quite, you know.
I think it's contemporary because it's very human. We were just talking to somebody from Spinal Research, not-for-profit organization that helps people with spinal cord injuries. And, you know, we were sort of actually contrasting people who acquire a disability. It's very different to being born with a disability. If you're born with a disability, whatever that might be, it might be that you are deaf. It might be that you are paraplegic, you have spina bifida or something like that. That's very different to what happened to Christopher, or what happens to millions of people who have accidents in all spheres of life. And of course, the natural human response to that is, I want to get better. I want to do things again. I want to go back to how I was. That's a very human thing. And of course, that's going to be your psychological focus. I think for Dana, she could empathize with that, but she had to deal with having your most special person in your life not be able to do a thing for himself without a team of people around them. So she's having to deal with that. And I think the reason that bifurcation, tomorrow's cure and today's care, that was very much because she was having to deal with today's care, and she knew that hundreds of thousands of other people caring for people who just suffered an accident of that kind, that she was representing them, and Christopher was representing the people who wanted to get fixed, as it were.
There's one moment though, I think, and we start the film like this, so sometime at the end of the film you forget that it was there. The fact he decided to leave, the fact that she tells you, I love you, you're the person. There's an highlight on her about making him take that decision. But he decides to leave. Do you see what I mean, Nigel? He decides. So we can criticize Chris, you know, people from the disability community can criticize, but Chris has decided to try to fight it. But for me, Chris, having accepted to leave, and then that his decision is to survive, we were discussing it earlier. He pushed himself so much to try to find solution. He died within 9 years.
He sacrificed exercising on the vent because he wanted to go and direct a film.
And just like the way, at the time, all the exercises he was imposing on himself were groundbreaking things. He was a guinea pig, and the impact on his body and the impact on his health is not quite understood yet. Do you see what I mean? So he didn't stay behind it just like, how I'm raising money and trying to find solution. We didn't use that completely, but Will said one time that any drugs, anything that would have happened, his dad would have taken it. And he was even jealous of rats in the lab, that he would have wanted to be, him.
Yeah.
Some rats managed to walk again. He wanted to be a rat in the lab, try everything on me. And even if he would never have maybe completely said that, but he would have gone to as far as possible to get walking. Get better is the wrong term, but he wanted to try to walk. And with the purpose of walking, he might have improved many things for other people along the way. So I really still very positive.
Yeah.
That's what we wanted to do.
I think that's absolutely right.
Just to circle back slightly, that phrase, "You are still you and I love you," I did make a note of it as it went by. And it is the kind of phrase that, is a very contemporary one in terms of acceptance. It's said a lot now, I'm sure. So that did resonate with me. You structured and wove the themes through your story beautifully well. I know it was picked up at Sundance. Congratulations for that. Now, were there any changes that you could make to it because it was picked up by a studio?
I mean, you're absolutely right to pick up on this, and it's something we're very keen to highlight, because I think that the perception now, oh God, it's DC Studios on the front of it. Obviously this is somehow part of the new DC rebrand, and the kind of harbinger of the next Superman film and all of that. Nothing could be further from the truth. For a start, the film was made entirely independently for a pretty low budget, frankly. And we got to a point when we submitted it to Sundance. It was the film we wanted to make. We didn't, want to. That was it from our point of view. We love being in the situation. We're quite disciplined about this. Picture lock means picture lock. We don't want anyone to open the film up after that, because it's the film that we want to make. And we kind of got to a point where we landed it with our various executives and financiers on the film. That was picture lock. That's what went to Sundance. It did not change after Sundance. We had an old school bidding war that started in the car park after our first screening, which was really wonderful. And I can't remember who one of the other bidders said, was there anything you'd want to change? And we said, no, not really. The thing we're supposed to be worried about with Warner's is that somehow they would want to give us a whole set of notes and so on. Couldn't be further from the truth. They absolutely loved it as it was. They didn't want us to touch anything. I think the only thing we did was put the DC logo on the front of it and replace our own logos with DC and HBO and CNN. I mean, something that is quite interesting on this is just that we got every single frame of archive and millimeter of music that we could out of them, and we tried to get more, and they said, don't push your luck. This was all before Sundance, and we had to sign everything off before Sundance. And there was a point where we kind of came back, and I was thinking, God, there's one piece of music that of John Williams' score that I would love to have used in the cut. And Ilan had actually, we had it in it at one point, and we were told couldn't have it. And Ilan, our composer, had kind of like stitched together in a very last minute way a couple of his other cues, and he put it on, and I was determined we were going to go back to John Williams. And actually we played the two clips with John Williams and with Ilan's music just for ourselves to sort of like, so that we could make a decision on it. And Ilan's music was so much more appropriate actually for the film ultimately.
At that point,
especially. At that point, yeah. And because, in a sense, Ilan's music is Christopher's voice and John Williams' music is Superman. So
no,
there was
John Williams would have Nigel would have sounded, this is a piece of archive, where what we've done a lot through is that we use archive and recompose it to our own purposes in terms of storytelling. And by using Ilan's music there, Ilan, where we came from the scene before and where we go afterwards, make more narrative and emotional sense.
Necessity is the mother of invention, isn't it? You actually realize you're not going to be able to use that piece of footage or that piece of music or whatever, and you have to kind of come up with a solution.
Tell me about the imagery. We're talking about that beautiful graphic sequence. Ian, were you more responsible? I'm not taking anything away from the relationship, but as a visual stylist, and look, Peter's sitting right back in the frame. As a visual stylist.
No, I don't think so, because I think what's kind of a bit weird and in a way very lucky between ourselves is, I think if you look at our two backgrounds and where we come from, yes, you could assume visually or potentially narratively, because Peter has more has credit as a writer. But I think we discuss everything, and we learned very quickly over 3 movies as well about how we work together and what our film needs. And when we saw we were making the title sequence, we saw how much we could travel through it, moving the camera around. And, with documentary, a lot of it is quite static, because you don't shoot a crane shot. So you don't have CG, like physical effects as much. You could do it, but it's not. The 3D and the CGI allowed us to be more cinematic and more creative like this, which we kind of like.
Because he's been very modest. I will just say that I mean, he has a wonderful visual imagination. And just to take a little case in point, we discussed the idea of the statue with Passion Pictures CG department, and they, who are fantastic, brought so much to it. They showed us one of their first sketches of Superman sort of in flight, as it were. I think they showed it on an iPad, and Ian literally sort of like turned it upside down, and suddenly Superman was falling. I mean, that sounds so obvious, but actually it's not that obvious. It gave us that notion of rising and falling.
Did you have any other visual ideas that you considered but dropped? I know, because the visual palette was fairly simple.
That's partly a function of budget, I have to say. This was not made for very much money, this film. So I think it behoves us to be really quite responsible and disciplined about the way that we think about that material.
And it's better one idea achieved to its highest standard that loads of half-house done, and we've both watched documentaries in the past. Maybe the story is great and it's very good, but we feel visually it's just not quite there. So it's about as well being quite disciplined with ourselves and try to push. I shot a lot of music videos, and you have very limited budget, so you have to stretch your budget within one day, and you have to come up with. And even if I didn't do CGI in my music video, it's the same thing. If we can do one statue, how can we stretch that statue? And the other thing, we like to have a visual identity that tie up the film.
Yeah.
And if that motif comes back, it's got something quite amazing.
Of course, there is a resonance that grows. It develops its own. It carries its own weight and meaning through the film.
Well, we're thinking about this stuff literally from day one. I mean, we're looking at another project at the moment, and we're more interested in talking about what we could do with a camera than actually what archive we're going to find, because we know we're going to find the archive. I think that where we lucked out with Superman is there was so much fantastic archive, so we didn't, we never felt the lack of rushes. Yeah,
for better word. We knew when we started looking at his life post-accident that the legacy is left after that still has an impact right now through the children and the money to raise and the foundation. It's I won't lie, it's the Superman aspect of it, despite, we both said, oh my God, how cool it is to do the original story of Superman. Very quickly was the least interesting and the least important in the film.
Yes. One very quick thing apropos of that. The thing is that when we made Rising Phoenix, we burned with that subject. That was something that we became passionate about, and the release of it was disappointing, to be frank. And I think ultimately it wasn't our fault, the film's fault, Netflix's fault. It was COVID, basically. Well, COVID as well, but I think also there was a real problem with getting audiences to engage with disability, which one can understand, if there's got choice of, but when you have a superhero story, effectively with a disability, when you've got Superman acquiring it, then it's a totally different thing. So I think that popular cultural element of the story is what allowed us to sort of smuggle in the much harder stuff that Chris goes through.
One last question. You're dealing with everyone's memories. You're telling a story of someone who everyone already has an opinion of. How hard is that for you? Every person in your audience has their own version of who Christopher Reeve was and what Superman meant to them, if you're from a certain generation as a child.
I think you just have to make your own version. I think it'd be really arrogant to say that it's the film, it's exactly Christopher Reeve, and we'll never say that. But I think the reaction from the family, the children, the friends, and everyone who watch it, for them, it feels as close as they remembered him. They remembered the relationship with Dana. They remembered all the things. So I think it's more about both of us feeling we have made the film we think is the right way to emotionally connect with Chris. We always feel really responsible of everyone sharing the memories with us, because we didn't live with Chris. We didn't lose him in 2004 when he died. We were not the close friend. We might have read about it and felt like, oh, that's really sad. Like you read, but the children, the Senator Kerry, the Whoopi Goldberg, the Susan Sarandon, all those famous people, and then the other member of the family, the people that work closely with them from the assistant and stuff, those people were there every day. Those people, life was for maybe 12 hours a day or even more. They were connected with Chris. So when Chris disappeared, that really affected them. And us, we really feel like we can't do anything anymore. Chris is not with us, but we can do justice and hold a very high standard from ourselves and ask a lot from ourselves to make sure that everyone who remains still feel that we've carried the legacy properly, and the legacy through this film, their names, meaning Dana and Chris, is well respected and will be put in the right light. I think that's something emotionally we feel extremely passionate and extremely responsible.
Absolutely, but we really do our work. We don't just rely on what we're told. We spent a long time with his paper archives. So we read everything from his university essays to the journal that he kept while he was going through therapy after he broke up from Gay to, we read a lot of material in the family archives, and, you kind of start getting the measure of someone and getting an instinct for who they are and, where the flaws as well as the virtues were. And we really wanted to make sure that the film shows the man in full as much as possible. So, I think, you're right. But somebody else could come along and probably make a very different portrayal of Christopher Reeve. But I kind of feel that we were true to something.
Yeah, what we set out to do. And I think, we have to give credit to people who came and asked us to do it, because it didn't originate with us. But even the children did their homework about the potential directors that would be tackling the story of the family. And they had seen our films and they really felt we were the right people. Then we met and we got on like house on fire. And I think that's right. You have to find the right directors to do the right story. You have to find the right writers. It's not everyone, there are stories, me and Peter, we look at it and like, not for us. We're very quick. Between Rising Phoenix and Superman, Rising Phoenix came in August 2020. We now, Superman is going to be in the cinema in the UK the 1st of November 2024. It's 4 years between the two films.
No one wants to invite us. No, it's not true.
Don't say that.
Don't say that. Peter and Ian, thank you so much for giving me the time to talk so beautifully about a film, a beautiful, rich, interesting documentary. I'm sure it'll do wonderfully well in the UK, as it has done everywhere else in the world. So good luck with it.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thanks, Nigel.
I hope you found that conversation with Peter Ettedgui and Ian Bonhôte useful. For me, the big lesson from this conversation is that emotion over information isn't a slogan, it's a structural choice. If the emotional spine isn't there, no amount of extra detail will save the film, and none of that happens by accident. If you're struggling to turn your own idea into a clear, powerful documentary, and you want help applying this kind of thinking to your work, you can watch a free DocFix case study at apply.thedocfix.com. I walk through the exact process I use on projects like Formula One Drive to Survive and Sunderland Till I Die, and my work with Sir David Attenborough. If you enjoyed this episode, it would really help if you shared it with someone who'd benefit from it, or left a review wherever you listen to podcasts. It makes a big difference in getting this to more filmmakers who need it. That's all for today. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.